Wow, thanks for hanging out. Hopefully what we have for y'all to round off this wonderful conference. And before I even begin, I really want to thank Sharon and everybody that was on the organizing committee, and Mitchell and the folks at Live Live Well, and everybody for showing up. And I think it's been an exceptional couple of days. It's had a really good vibe, and I've heard some things that I wish I would have said. And so it's delightful to meet new colleagues and rekindle old friendships. So good on y'all for making a really great conference. So when I was asked to do this part of this presentation, and it was going to come into a panel, well, I got to take that back. I had an idea to do this, and I didn't think Sharon would actually let me do it. But I put the idea forward, and she said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And then I looked at the people who were going to be on the panel, and I said, well, who am I to hog all the time? There are some pretty exceptional people with loads of research, clinical practice, training practice that I get to share the stage with. And then I look around the room, and there's hundreds of years of wisdom, collective practice that we can draw from to maybe, to round out the conference, use it to have a broader conversation about how we work with people, what we think about how we work with people, what we're doing now, how could we be doing it differently? So the spirit of this last session is around a broad conversation. I have a few things that I would like to kind of put out there as ideas to stimulate some discussion. Nicole's going to follow me, and then the other panel members are going to come up as well, and then we're going to hopefully share some thoughts and then have a broader conversation. So that's the way it's going to flow. So it's a little unorthodox, but anybody who's known me for more than a week or two will realize that that's just the way I roll. So mistaking the map for the territory. It struck me a while back when, the green one, where I lived in New Zealand for about 15 years before coming over here. And one of my most favorite places that I've ever lived in the world is Lyttleton, New Zealand. It's a beautiful harbor town over the Port Hills. Well, you go through the Port Hills, through a tunnel, and you come to Lyttleton, right outside of Christchurch. If anybody's been there, you'll have a sense of where it is. And if you look at Lyttleton, it's built up on a hill. And so it's a lot of twisty-turny roads, and some of the roads are what's known as paper roads. They exist on a map, but they don't exist, right? And part of the reason for this, and when I looked up, paper roads on Wikipedia, it says, well, they're very common in New Zealand. But a lot of the areas were mapped out, and then the plans were drawn up for the cities in England. So in Petone, outside of Wellington, the houses don't face the sun. Why would they? Because they were designed in the northern hemisphere. And so sometimes you'll be going down a road, and this is what the road looks like. It exists on paper, but it was impossible to build a road because it was too steep. Or the asphalt just stops and you just go straight off into the bush. And I thought, well, that's an interesting metaphor to work with when thinking about addiction services and the way we think about addiction services, as Fraser was saying in his talk, from the big picture perspective. Because we have a map that we use. We have a biopsychosocial, spiritual, cultural map. But the biopsychosocial it's been around as long as I've been working in the addiction field, and probably way before then. And it's a pretty handy, universal way of starting to conceptualize and formulate people when they come into our services. And it's pretty handy because if we look at it from a treatment perspective, if we look at biological aspect of person, we have psychopharmacology. We have a lot of really effective drugs that can help people reduce their cravings, can help people withdraw, can help people do with the opioid therapy. If you look at biological, and I don't know how many of y'all have looked in there's about 2 decades of literature around exercise and substance use And it's a pretty positive intervention to get people physically moving around consistently over time, and it's been trialed in lots of different areas. Nutrition's another emerging area. We are what we eat, literally. And so there are people exploring how can we look at how people eat in regards to addiction treatment and the food that we give people while they're in detox and while they're in early recovery and rehabilitation services might actually have an effect on their mood, their circadian cycles, and just their general well-being, right? And so then we have the psychological realm, which is fantastic. What do we have? We've been talking about it a lot at this conference. We have evidence-based practice, right? CBT, MI, MET, interpersonal therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. We have, I forgot how many evidence-based practices there are that SAMHSA has. I think it's about 220 or something like that. You know, and how something gets to be an evidence-based practice, we could debate that for a long time. But we have a lot of different hats for a lot of different heads, right? So we have a lot of evidence-based practices that we can employ. Socially, we're David Best and other people have been talking about, social capital, relationships. We know that when people get engaged in meaningful, purposeful relationships that tend not to focus around the getting and using of drugs and gambling, that they tend to kind of start changing their lifestyle, particularly if they start to value those relationships more than they value the substance or the behavior. So we have a map, and we have a really good map, right? And we have ways of kind of, Fraser was talking earlier about, in his talk about, we have the 4 Ps. We have the way of kind of putting things together. But then we enter in something else. Then we enter in the human condition, right? And I think Keith Richards kind of defies a lot of this, Not everybody fits our map. Our map doesn't fit the human territory all the time, right? People make choices about what they want to do, how they want to be, and who they are. And this creates an issue for us sometimes when the map doesn't fit the territory. Historically, we'd often blame the person. They just don't get it. They're not motivated. They are resistant to treatment, right? And we have found, and Igor was talking about that earlier, that making people feel bad doesn't change addictive behaviors. I don't know why we keep trying it, because I don't know many people that have struggled with drug and alcohol or gambling or other addictive problems that don't already feel pretty damn bad. And so we still kind of operate under this idea as if we can make them feel worse, they'll change. So that's our biopsychosocial map. That's our territory. Sometimes it fits, sometimes it doesn't. And we're doing the best we can. And then, I don't know where I've been for the past 3 years, but about 6 months ago, I read some Australian research that has begun to change the way that I think about how we deliver services and the services that we deliver. And I'm not saying that what we're doing is it right. I'm just wondering how we can do it differently. And so Rebecca McKinton and colleagues published the MATE study. How many people have read this study? Well, you're one of the authors, Nicole. 2, 3, 4 people. This was a 3-year follow-up study, a 3-year study of people that were admitted into residential rehabilitation services for primary drug of choice, methamphetamine, right? It wasn't a treatment randomized controlled trial. It was tracking people from day one to getting as many people as they could to the end of 3 years. And I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but they had an exceptional follow-up rate. So that I commend the researchers and the assistants for being able to track all the people. So they tracked people for 3 years. They had a host of measures. And here was one of the conclusions that when I read this, I was floored. Can everybody see it? I can read it if you can. That's pretty powerful. That's pretty powerful, right? And as Fraser might choose to talk about, or Igor might choose to talk about, is that's not uncommon. This isn't uniquely Australian. It has something to do with the ebb and the flow that Igor was talking about, something the way we conceptualize drug and alcohol problems, and I'd probably say gambling outcomes tend to be a little bit better. But when I read that, I was thinking, well, I wonder how we could do better. And being at this conference this week, my idea, you guys have given me so many ideas, and I'm so fortunate that my team gets to be here, that we can go back and we can talk about this stuff. How can we do things better? I'm not really worried about, pointing fingers about the past. It's how do we move forward? Because it's science. Science builds on science, and hopefully it takes us forward. And then we've had this, what is it? I don't know. Somebody who's been around longer than me. How long have you been hearing bridging the gap from research to practice? Right? 25 years, 30 years? I remember some of those first conferences, bridging the gap, and I was like, wow, something magic's going to happen, We're going to all of a sudden learn. And every now and then it feels like that gap gets bridged, but then you look at the research and you see it's collapsed, right? Something hasn't quite stuck. And what I like about this photo is that there are people on both sides looking at each other, right? And that's the way it feels sometimes as a clinician, as a researcher, and as somebody who's in charge of delivering programs. So here's what I think, and I'm wrapping up. I got a couple other things to say, because this is about good practice. And what I'd be interested in for y'all to be thinking about, or whatever else you want to talk about as we get going from what comes up, is this isn't about how do you bridge the gap, but I wonder if there's some things that we're missing that would help support the bridge so it doesn't collapse. And I'm really interested in hearing what my colleagues say about that. And the other term that gets knocked around a lot is good practice. And I remember Steve Rolnick was talking with me about this a few years ago, and it really hit me. He said, we're not talking about best practice, we're talking about good practice. And I'm like, well, what is it? And so I've been on this quest to try to figure out, well, what is good practice? And so this is the experiential part of the thing, is I'm really interested in hearing what other people say as the basics of good practice. What are the things that consistently seem to be important that we utilize to engage and help people maintain change over time, right? What is it on the micro level? What is it on the macro level? So I think bottom line for me is having good impersonal skills as a clinician, having some psychological approaches and interventions that are universal and have some evidence behind them. You can't take away from warmth, kindness, politeness, and honesty in working with your colleagues and your clients. I think Carl Rogers' ideas around person-centered counseling are quite universal and have stood the test of time. The best we can afford people unconditional positive regard, particularly people with addiction problems, is incredibly important. The role of empathy is I think, is sort of the cement that holds the whole thing together. Being able to use standalone and blended practices with Fidelity. And this is really important because Fidelity is a degree to the exactness which something is copied or reproduced. And we know that it's important, right? We know that Fidelity is important. And if you look at this area that's emerging, this area called implementation science, and people have been talking about it from different perspectives today, is we're starting to find out that and the whole area of implementation science is how do we work with complex systems in a way in which we can provide better outcomes. And often it has to do with implementing evidence-based practices into everyday work, right? And it's fascinating what some of the things they found out. Now here's a little bit of outcome they did with teachers, and I think it's transferable to working with clinicians. So they were looking at knowledge, skill demonstration, and then did people actually use these things in the classroom? So these are things that they would do in training sessions, right? They would give people the theory and discussion about the teaching modality they wanted to do. They would have them demonstrate it in training. They would have them practice it, and they'd give it feedback in training. And then they looked at coaching in the classroom when they actually gave them supervision or some coaching about what they were actually doing, right? Self-report as a supervisor doesn't always tell you what's going on in the room, right? You can only give good feedback, objective feedback on what you see. What is amazing to me is if you look at actually how things got utilized in the classroom, giving people the theory doesn't change it, right? letting people practice doesn't translate into practice. Didn't translate into practice. Giving them some practice and feedback in the training session modestly, minutely did it. But when you actually came alongside them and you could give them some feedback of the things that they were doing, appropriately and the things that they could work better on, you had a much more higher demonstration rate that people were actually doing this. And what that translates is that those students were getting the benefit of the teaching method that was allotted to them. I would encourage y'all to look up implementation science. I think it's another area that we could draw from. And the organizations that I was just talking in the session with New South Wales and Victoria that are already doing that, and Fraser was talking about that as well. How do we deal with complexity? Am I going? Oh, yeah. Now, the last thing here's what I want to close on, right? And this is around Fidelity. And Dean Fixens is one of the pioneers in implementation science. And I believe Igor was at the conference too when he said this. People cannot benefit from a treatment that they did not receive, right? I could say I do CBT, but if I don't have any idea whether I'm doing it or not, the person's not getting the benefit that they want. And I would also add that clinicians cannot utilize approaches that they don't know how to do. Right? There's a difference between learning about something and learning how to do something. And so part of that is, as supervisors, as managers, as a clinician, it's our responsibility to figure out, to work with approaches that we can get feedback on to know whether we're doing it or not. Because that's the evidence-based practice, is that you're doing it as it was researched that led to the outcome, not that you're taking bits and pieces of this, that, and the other, and you're weaving it together, and you're having an approach. That's sort of like playing golf in the dark. You can hit the ball, but you have no idea where it went. Right? So you have to be able to follow your shot. And the last thing I'll just add is that I think critical and reflective thinking, open-mindedness, willingness to be wrong, that's a big challenge for a lot of folks in the addiction field because we're so committed to being right. And the ability to adapt to new information and new experience. And the bottom line is, I don't believe it's always what we do, but how we do it. As long as what we're doing has some demonstrated efficacy. I think the spirit of an MI is a great way to do a service. You're not going to hurt anybody if you work in partnership with them, if you work in an accepting way, you support their autonomy, you're compassionate, and you listen to them about what it is they want, how it is they are, what's important to them, what are their goals and values, and how can we help them achieve their goals, not what we think they should be doing. And our aim, again, is to be helpful and not be right. And if, my being right is getting in the way of being helpful, I need to rethink what I'm doing. So that's me.